Watch the ending of Casino carefully. Not the cornfield, not the baseball bats. Before all of that, watch the moment Nicky Santoro is called back to Chicago. Watch how it happens. Watch who is involved. The movie gives you the mechanics of it in broad strokes. The bosses decided, the order went out, and Nicky walked into a trap he did not see coming. It is presented as the inevitable conclusion of everything that had been building since the moment he arrived in Las Vegas. But there is a dimension to how Tony Spilotro, the real man behind Nicky Santoro, actually met his end that Casino only partially captures. A dimension that involves betrayal in its most complete form. Not betrayal by strangers, not betrayal by enemies. Betrayal by the person who knew him better than almost anyone alive, the person who had stood beside him since they were 12 years old, shining shoes on opposite sides of a Chicago street, the person who, in the movie, is the one who leads him to his death. That person's name was Frank Collada. And the story of what happened between Tony Spilotro and Frank Collada, the real story, not the version the movie compresses into a few scenes, is one of the most consequential betrayals in the history of American organized crime. To understand what Collada meant to Spilotro, you have to go back to the beginning. Not Las Vegas. Chicago, the streets of the same neighborhood in the same years, where two boys growing up around the same world of petty crime and organized violence found each other and decided early and without much deliberation that they were going to make their way together. Frank Collada and Tony Spilotro met as children. They shined shoes as kids, competed for the same corners, and became friends in the way that certain friendships form in certain neighborhoods, not through sentiment, but through proximity and mutual recognition. They were the same kind of person. They understood the same things. They wanted the same things, or close enough to the same things, that their paths ran parallel for decades. They committed crimes together as teenagers. They learned the same trade, burglary, robbery, the whole infrastructure of low-level criminal enterprise that served as the entry point for anyone who wanted to work their way up inside the Chicago outfit. Spilotro had his eye on something bigger from very early on. He once told Collada directly, one day he would be boss of the outfit. Collada was more measured in his ambitions. He was content to earn, to operate, to stay out of the political machinery of the organization, but the friendship held. For decades, across Chicago and eventually across the desert, the friendship held. When Spilotro was sent to Las Vegas in 1971 to protect the outfit's casino interests, Collada stayed behind in Chicago. It was not until 1979 that Spilotro reached back and asked for him directly. He needed someone he trusted, someone who could run a crew, manage the street-level operations in Las Vegas that Spilotro himself could no longer handle once the Nevada Gaming Commission had placed him in the black book and banned him from every casino in the state. Joey Lombardo, Spilotro's supervisor back in Chicago, told Collada personally that Spilotro wanted him out there and that he was the only one Spilotro trusted. That sentence matters. The only one he trusted. In a world where trust was the rarest and most valuable commodity, Tony Spilotro had pointed to Frank Collada as the one man he was certain of. Collada arrived in Las Vegas and became what the movie calls Frank Marino, Nicky Santoro's right-hand man, his street lieutenant, the person closest to him in the operation. He assembled the burglary crew that the press would eventually dub the Hole in the Wall gang. He ran the day-to-day criminal enterprise while Spilotro provided the organizational cover and the outfit connections. Together, they were, for several years, the most effective criminal partnership operating in Las Vegas. Now, here is what Casino does not fully show you. The friendship between Spilotro and Collada did not end because of a decision Collada made. It ended because of a decision Spilotro made. And understanding that decision is the key to understanding everything that followed. In July of 1981, the Hole in the Wall gang was arrested during a botched burglary of a home goods store on East Sahara Avenue. The operation fell apart because of an informant inside the crew, a man named Sal Romano, who had been providing information to law enforcement. The arrests were devastating. Collada, several of his crew members, and others connected to the operation were taken into custody. What happened next changed everything. As Collada sat facing serious federal charges, word reached him through channels he trusted. The FBI had a wiretapped recording a conversation in which Tony Spilotro could be heard discussing having Collada killed. Not arrested, not cut loose from the operation, killed. The FBI played that recording for Collada directly. They sat across from him and let him listen to his oldest friend, the man who had told him he was the only one he trusted, arranging to have him murdered. The specific phrase that investigators reported Spilotro using in that recording was that they needed to clean their dirty laundry. The dirty laundry was Frank Collada, the man who had come to Las Vegas because Spilotro said he was the only one he trusted, had become, in Spilotro's calculation, a liability that needed to be eliminated before he could talk. Collada had spent his entire life operating on the principle that loyalty meant something, that the bonds formed in Chicago, on those streets, over decades of shared crimes and shared risks, had a weight that did not simply dissolve when circumstances became inconvenient. What the FBI played him in that room told him that the man he had trusted most had already decided otherwise. In May of 1982, Frank Collada finalized his agreement with federal prosecutors and entered the Witness Protection Program. The most dangerous man in Las Vegas, the person who had been standing closest to Tony Spilotro for 3 years, had decided to talk. And he had a great deal to say. What Collada told federal investigators and federal prosecutors over the years that followed was devastating in its scope. Between 1982 and 1988, his cooperation led to indictments of 19 men on federal racketeering charges, 4 men on murder charges in Illinois, and 5 men on Nevada burglary charges. 14 of 15 federal convictions that came out of that period were connected to Tony Spilotro. Collada testified that Spilotro had been secretly taking a cut of all burglaries and robberies in Las Vegas, money he was hiding from the outfit bosses in Chicago, the men who had sent him there and who believed the operation existed to serve their interests, not his. He told me in 1978, Collada testified in open court, that no one was to know he was getting a cut because he did not want any problems with the people back in Chicago. That testimony went directly to the heart of the judgment the outfit had been forming about Spilotro for years. It confirmed what they suspected. It put it on the record, and it came from the mouth of the man who had been standing beside Spilotro the entire time, the man Spilotro had called the only one he trusted, and then tried to have killed before he could say what he knew. Screenwriter Nicholas Pileggi, who co-wrote Casino with Scorsese and who spent years researching the real events, was direct about what Collada meant to the entire project. Without Frank Collada, Pileggi said, there would have been no Casino. Now consider the most remarkable detail of all, the detail that connects Frank Collada not just to the story of Tony Spilotro's downfall, but to the specific way the movie chose to tell that story. When Martin Scorsese was making Casino, he hired Frank Collada as a technical advisor. The man who had been Spilotro's right-hand man, who had turned government witness and helped dismantle everything Spilotro had built, was now sitting on set helping a Hollywood director reconstruct it. Collada inspired the character of Frank Marino, Nicky Santoro's closest associate, played by Frank Vincent in the film. And Collada himself appeared on screen in a small role, playing a hitman. But here is the part that stops you cold when you know the real history. In Casino, it is Frank Marino who is present at Nicky Santoro's death. It is Frank Marino who is among the men in the cornfield when the brothers are beaten. Scorsese made a deliberate artistic choice to put the Collada character, the closest friend, the most trusted associate at the scene of the killing. The movie implies that Marino was part of the apparatus that lured Nicky to his end. When Collada saw this in the script, he was not pleased. He objected. He told Scorsese that the Marino character's presence at the murder did not reflect what actually happened. And he was right. By 1986, the real Collada was in witness protection, completely removed from the operation, unable to have been physically present at anything the outfit was doing. He could not have been in that cornfield or that basement. He was already gone. But Scorsese's response to Collada's objection has been documented. The director told him that the film needed it this way. That dramatically, emotionally, the story required that the person closest to Nicky be the one present at his death. That the betrayal had to be made visible on screen in a way that pure organizational mechanics could not convey. Scorsese persuaded Collada to accept it on the basis that Nicky could only be lured to his death by a trusted friend. Collada accepted it, and in doing so, he allowed a film to encode into its final act a truth that was dramatic rather than literal, but which pointed, despite its inaccuracies of detail, towards something real. Because even if Collada was not in that basement in Bensonville on the 14th of June, 1986, his shadow was there. His testimony had been there. His decision to talk, made 4 years earlier in a room where the FBI played him a recording of his oldest friend arranging his murder, had set everything in motion that led to that basement. The movie gives you Frank Marino swinging a bat. The reality is both simpler and more devastating. The real betrayal did not happen in a cornfield. It happened in a federal building in 1982 when a man who had shined shoes on a Chicago street corner with Tony Spilotro 40 years earlier sat across from FBI agents and decided that the friendship, the original foundational friendship on which everything in Las Vegas had been built, was over. It was over because Spilotro had made it over first. He had heard the same thing. Every man in his position eventually hears that someone close to him was becoming a problem, and he had responded the only way he knew how. He had tried to eliminate the problem. What he did not account for was that the problem had already heard about it, and that the problem was going to make sure the hearing happened before the elimination. Collada later reflected on all of it publicly. He said he had no great hate for Spilotro, even knowing what had been arranged. They had grown up together. They had done everything together. He acknowledged that Tony had caused the outfit enormous problems, had stopped generating money, had become something that could no longer be managed or contained. And he said something that captures the cold arithmetic of that world with unsettling precision. He said that once you had to kill one of them, you had to kill the other one too, because you could not leave the surviving brother alive to come looking for the men who had done it. That sentence is the real ending of Casino. Not the cornfield, not the bats, not the bodies found by a farmer who thought someone had buried a deer. The real ending is two men who shined shoes on opposite sides of a Chicago street corner as children, who built something together and then dismantled each other, and who ended up on opposite sides of a federal courtroom, one of them already dead, by the time the trials that used his old friend's testimony finally came to their conclusion in 2007. Casino shows you a betrayal. It puts Frank Marino in the cornfield to make that betrayal visible. And on a certain level, the movie is right to do it, because whatever the literal facts of who was physically present in that basement in Bensonville, the person who had set the whole chain of events in motion, who had given the FBI what they needed, who had put names and dates and specific criminal acts on the record, who had testified in open court about the money Spilotro was hiding from Chicago, was Frank Collada. The man Spilotro had called the only one he trusted. The man Spilotro had then tried to kill, Tony Spilotro, walked into that basement in Bensonville believing he was going to a meeting about a promotion. He had no idea what was waiting for him, but the road that led him there had been built brick by brick from the moment he decided that Frank Collada had become dirty laundry that needed to be cleaned. He pulled the thread himself. And once it started unraveling, there was nothing, not 15 years in Las Vegas, not 22 murders, not the most feared reputation the Chicago outfit had ever produced that could stop it.